Good evening. Welcome to the Avenue G Church of Christ Sunday evening Bible study here in Temple, Texas. On our last study, we ended in Genesis 47, and Jacob was on his deathbed and asking Joseph to bury him in Canaan. Now, we've skipped past chapters 48 and 49, and the most that I got out of it, or what I can remember most about them, was that Jacob was giving his sons his blessings before he had passed. And what sticks out most is that he told Reuben and Simeon that they would not get the share that they were supposed to get. You know, Reuben and Simeon were brothers by Leah, and the reason he wasn't going to do it for Reuben was because Reuben had committed what they call it incest, and I don't know why they say incest. It wasn't with his mother, but it was with his brother's mother, or one of Jacob's concubines, or one of the maids of Rachel or Leah. I can't remember which one. But Simeon, he was unhappy with Simeon because of what he did to the Shechemites. You know, when they had Shechem had raped the daughter Dinah, which was Reuben and Simeon's sister. They went about and they all got circumcised, and while they were healing from the circumcision, Simeon and Levi were the leaders and killing all of them. Well, that brings us to where we are now. Oh, one other thing that I remember so much was that Jacob took Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he said, hey, he told Joseph, these are my sons. They're going to be taking the place of Reuben and Simeon, and that they would get an inheritance. And they would get an inheritance. He said that they were going to be his adopted sons. He said, these are my sons. They're no longer your sons, but the ones that you have after this, they'll be yours. But these two are going to be mine. And that brings us to where we are now. And that is in chapter 50 of Genesis. And we're going to be starting off with, the name of our lesson is Mourning of Jacob. Not morning and evening, but the morning when they were mourning Jacob. And that's going to be Genesis 50, verses 1 through 14. And some of our topics that we're going to be talking about Joseph's reaction to his father's death, and the funeral plan that was made for Jacob, the days of mourning by the Egyptians, Joseph's request of Pharaoh, the place of mourning by the Israelites. And the verse that we chose to go along with our lesson today was Genesis 46 and 4. And it reads, I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again. And Joseph will put his hands on your eyes. If you will, why don't you join us in prayer? Father, Most High God, deliverer and protector of mankind, I want to thank you once again, Father, for sending your son, Jesus, to die on the cross so that we may live, so that we will be able to find salvation. I want to thank you, Father, for watching over us and keeping us safe from last week to now. We pray, Father, that you will be with those who are sick, that you will help all of those who are in some type of affliction. Help those, Father, who are feeling low because of the situation that we are in. Let them remember, Father, that you're still on the throne, and there are better days to come than what we have been going through. Let us hold fast. Let us stay firm in your word and do your will. For these and all blessings we do pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Our scriptures, Genesis 50, verses 1 through 14. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, so the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Now, when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I am dying, and in my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now, therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back." And Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father, as he had made you to swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones, their flocks, and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. Then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a deep mourning of the Egyptians." Therefore, its name was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond the Jordan. So his sons did for him just as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham brought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as property for a burial place. And after he had buried his father Joseph, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who went up with him to bury his father. Okay, I want to share with you a short video about Machpelah, where some patriarch and matriarchs were buried. That is Jacob, Isaac, Leah, Rebecca, and Joseph later on. And it's very interesting about some of the history.
When I leave Jerusalem, I feel like I can breathe again. I love Jerusalem stories. I love sharing Jerusalem stories, but I feel like when I'm in the city, I'm holding my breath. And here, I just let it out. This is the environment that I feel most alive in. But I have to tell you, life here was hard. It was really difficult, and it shaped the way people thought, and it shaped the way people believed. The Bible is a local book. Its stories and its poetry and its metaphors can't be moved to other locations and have the same impact as they do when you read them as part of this space. So let me help you get to know the Judean Hill Country just a little bit better. You can see that we're in the central mountains of this land, and they are big mountains. Very steep slopes, 60% of which is eroded to bedrock, and they plunge and terminate in these very, very narrow V-shaped valleys below us. The only natural farm field that exists is at the very bottom of this system. And if you're only going to farm that, you only have food from a very few acres. The only option, you have to build. Yes, you have to build your own farmland, acre by acre by acre by acre, bringing the soil from the bottom of the valley up to your terraced field, bagful by bagful, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. It takes 4 to 12 years to build just 1 acre of farmland here. That means that you build farm fields mostly for your children and grandchildren rather than for yourself. When the land takes generations to prepare for cultivation, it becomes an extremely valuable inheritance. So when we read about God's foundational promises to Abram and Sarah in the book of Genesis, a promise of ownership and prosperity, it is significant. Abraham had followed God's call, given over 50 years earlier, to leave his father's land in the east and migrate to this land. Abraham was a foreigner, an immigrant. Abraham even gives himself the title Ger. This means he is someone living off the land, someone who doesn't own land, a temporary resident. None of these imply belonging. And so Abraham waited for God's promise to come to life. He waited and waited and waited. Abraham and Sarah were now both over 120 years old. And like those who had built the terrace fields around them, they wondered if they would ever see the result. We're in Hebron, about 18 miles south of Jerusalem, and it's about as far south as you can get in Judah's hill country. We're here to talk about one of the saddest and the most enduring of the Judean hill country stories at this location, the Machpelah, or the tomb of the patriarchs. As readers of scripture, we've been waiting since Genesis 12 to find Abraham in possession of the land the Lord had promised to give him. God had not kept the promise he had made to Abraham and Sarah. He had promised Abraham growth in his family. He had promised him land, and he had promised him that from that family, on that land, blessing would be restored to the nations. But the moment comes into sharp focus when the family faces a crisis. Sarah has died, and they have no personal property to use as the family tomb. Abraham grieved. The text talks about his pouring out his heart over the loss of his beloved Sarah. He drags himself to the ancient city gate of Hebron and inquires if there might be someone here who would be willing to sell him a field with a cave where he might bury her. That's where the story comes in. It involves this location here, the tomb of the patriarchs. Ephron the Hittite steps up and begins the bargaining process. He says, "Oh, what is land cost between friends? Take it. The field and the cave that I own, they're yours." Abraham responds, "Look, I'll pay a fair price." His grief weighing him down. Ephron comes back, "Okay, it's worth 400 shekels, but what's that between friends?" Abraham says, "Okay." The bargaining that we would expect him to make is simply absent, his grief holding him back. And he takes his beloved Sarah and places her here. And only at this moment, when the deal is sealed with Ephron the Hittite, do we find the family that had been promised land actually owning deeded property. And what's also interesting about this place is that Abraham and some of his promised descendants were also buried here. Abram's son Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and then Isaac's son Jacob with his wife Leah. That's actually why Herod the Great built this incredible monument here. It's a 39-foot high wall that surrounds the field and the cave. It's because people throughout the Old Testament era and into the New Testament era and to this very moment come here to remember the vital relationship between this place and the promises that God made to Abram in Genesis 12. The promise of God not only started here. Through Sarah's death, it took root here. It wasn't until Sarah was buried in the ground that the promise began to be fulfilled. The promise of blessing, of light, of truth, not just for Abraham and his family, but for the whole world. But just like the labor-intensive, slow and persistent construction of the Judean hill country cultivated land, the promise would only fully blossom for a future generation.
Now, I want to mention that that building that Herod built was it was in Hebron, but the city wasn't originally right there. That was actually the field, and then they later on built the city around that building that Herod had built. And they talk about the burial places. Actually, the burial places are about five stories beneath the building, but and there was also something else that went with that story. The Israelites had not been allowed to go in and to visit that building or tomb for about 700 years. Well, they hadn't been allowed to go visit that tomb until 1967 when they had that war. Some type over in Israel, and they took their land over, and then the Israelites and the Muslim both worshiped Abraham in that building. But then one day, I think it was 1984, 1999, a Jewish male went in there and killed 29 Muslims. And then they separated it. They separated so that on half of them was for Muslims and the other half was for the Jews. And when the Jews had a special holiday, it was closed to the Muslims. And when the Muslims had a special holiday, it was closed to the Jews. But both Jews and Muslims worship Abraham in that building. We're going to start with our scripture. And we're going to start with Genesis 50 and verse 1. And it reads, "And Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him." Okay, Genesis 1. Genesis 1 started out, and what they said, what you remember most about Genesis 1 is they said, let there be light. Now we're at the end. We're at Genesis 50, and the light of one of the great patriarchs has gone out. That light goes out, and now Abraham has died. I'm sorry, Jacob has died. Now, Jacob has died. When Jacob died, he was 147 years old. And you got to remember that his father was 100, and his grandfather was 175, and his father was 180 years old when they died. Now, Joseph, at the death of his father had just passed on, gave his blessings to his son, and he got up and prayed to worship God at his bed, and he died. And Joseph weeps, and Joseph kisses him, and that's not so strange, because even nowadays, people will kiss or touch the deceased. A lot of people won't kiss the deceased, but a lot of people will touch the deceased to show their grief. And they talked about Joseph did this, but the other brothers probably did this also. They just don't mention it. Now, why was Joseph there? Why did they mention Joseph? But if you remember Genesis 46:4, we talked about how God had told Jacob that Joseph would close his eyes, and a lot of people die with their eyes open, and then normally they close their eyes. Well, Joseph was there at his death to close his eyes. Genesis 15, verse 2. "And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel." Physicians, but Joseph probably had his own physician. Being in the position that he was in, second in command over the whole country, he had his own physicians. Embalm his father. That's not the normal way. Well, it depends on what you mean by embalming. People do embalming a lot different. And I learned something about this. I think I mentioned before that the royalty was the ones that were mummified. But I found out that they had about 4 different ways of embalming people. And the royalty got the best embalming, but there were, if you had a couple of bucks, you get embalmed, but it wasn't done the way the royalty was, and you didn't have the burial place like royalty. And why were they going to embalm him? But you got to remember, he could have been buried in Egypt with no problem, but he had told his son he wanted to be buried where his family was, and that was back in Canaan. And if they were going to do that, they would have to preserve the body, keep it from putrefaction, that is, from decaying. They had to try, I think it was almost about 300 miles from where they were to get back to Machpelah. Embalming, well, embalming, it was some, these guys were artists, I guess you would call them. They were the greatest at the embalming. And what they would do, they would remove the major organs. What I read was they took out the lungs, they took out the stomach, they took out the heart, they took out the intestines. And what was really particular was they removed the brain. And, they didn't do like we might think of today where they cut open the skull and go in and just take the brain out. They used some kind of hook, long hook. They would stick it up the nose and take the brain out, pull the brain out piece by piece out of there. And of course, they wouldn't get it all out, but what they would do, they would put some type of liquid up there through the nose, and it would liquefy any brains that were left, and that way it would all come out. And then once they got through doing that, they would put those organs in jars, depending on which type of embalming they did, and then they would place them back into the body, or at least in the coffin. And they didn't remove muscles. They also put some kind of, I can't remember, natron or something, some kind of salt that they put in the body and helped it from decaying and stuff. Anyway, they said, when it was done, hey, the body looked just like it was normal. And then after they got through that, they would wrap it in linen. And the Jews did that also. Even you talk about Jesus, they wrapped him in linen. And you think about Lazarus, he was wrapped in linen. Genesis 53, 40 days were required for him. For such are the days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. It took 40 days to prepare the body with this embalming. All they did, they took 40 days to do that. And during this whole time, they were mourning for those 40 days. They weren't just sitting around, they were in mourning while that time was going on, and they were embalming the body. And then it took 30 more days of mourning when they anointed the body with spices and all. Another thing that the Jews were doing. And there was a total of 70 days. So they were in mourning for 70 days. Now, this wasn't actually the Jewish tradition. This was the Egyptian tradition, but I'm quite sure that Joseph was going along with their tradition and being in mourning. Now, when they did Pharaoh's bodies were mourned for a total of 72 days. Those first 40 days, they would be 42 days, and then the other 30, and that would make 72. It's something like, Pharaoh was the great God. It was their God. So, that's just like our president gets a 21-gun salute. But, if we had a statesman or we think of a congressman, well, they would get a 19-gun salute. So Jacob got 40 days embalming instead of 42, but I think this is all done because of the respect that they had for Joseph. Genesis 15, verse 4, it says, now when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying," okay, Joseph did not go to Pharaoh. He went to the household of Pharaoh. I had a problem with that. He went to Pharaoh. He didn't go to Pharaoh. He went to the households. He went to those who were his servants or elders or counselors and told him what he had to say. Because the reason he didn't go, well, this is what most people say, it was that he was in mourning. Now, you remember when you're in mourning, there are certain things that they do and certain things that they don't do. In mourning, they usually did not shave, and they may not have even bathed. And then if you remember, he couldn't go before Pharaoh like that. When we talked about when he left prison, before he left prison to go see Pharaoh, he had to bathe and get shaved and put on some new garments because he couldn't be presented before Pharaoh the way that he was. And you didn't go before Pharaoh if you were in mourning because you were considered unclean. And more time they were unclean because they didn't bathe and they didn't shave. Now he desired to ask Pharaoh for permission to do something. Genesis 50:5 says, "My father made me swear, saying, behold, I am dying. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now, therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back." Now, this is what Joseph is telling the servants to say to Pharaoh. He tells Pharaoh about the oath that he took from his father, where he said, "Hey, I'm going to," he told his father he's going to bury him back at Machpelah with the bones of his father. Now, Jacob said to bury him in a grave that was hewn out in Canaan or dug out in Canaan. Now, if you think about this had me thinking, he didn't dig, we don't hear about him digging out some land. What he did, his father, great grandfather, Abraham, brought that land. But what they say is that Jacob had went into that cave and dug him out some space in there for his body. Okay, Joseph couldn't just leave. He had somebody that was over. Only one man was over, and that was Pharaoh. But he needed to get Pharaoh's permission. He couldn't just leave his state and do it. Even those people here who have jobs and they're supervisors, there's still somebody over them, but they got to get permission to do certain things also. Now, it's not believed that this was the same Pharaoh that Joseph had been with the 7 days of plenty and 7 days of famine, but surely he knew about it. And Joseph, in fact, some people say Joseph may not have had the same position, but most say that Joseph still had his same position and he still was what we would call a prime minister. Genesis 50:6, and Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father, and he made you swear." Now, Pharaoh gives him the permission to go and do this. It's one thing about them. Joseph is still well known. It's like I said, it was only like I don't even say it was it had to be about 12 years after the famine had passed, because they came there and there was 5 years left, and then he lived there altogether for 17 years. It had to be about 12 years left, so it wasn't that long a time. But you remember, Pharaoh could have died because they didn't live to be that old. But anyway. They remember how Joseph saved Egypt 7 days of plenty and 7 days of famine. It wasn't that long. And you talk about, he told him that he took an oath. When you took an oath, that meant something back in those days. He told him, "Hey, you got to keep your oath. You gave your word, you had to keep your word." And the last wish of a person who was dying needed to be granted. I would say, as long as it wasn't unreasonable. And Genesis 57 says, so Joseph went to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. Joseph and his family got together, and they were going back to Canaan. All of Pharaoh's servants did not surely go. You know, they talked about well, that goes for both of them. All of them couldn't go because I think later on we're going to, it also mentioned that they left the children there, so they had to have somebody to take care of the children. And Pharaoh wasn't going to send everybody, all of those leaders, but a majority of those leaders went with him. They said that the diplomats, the governors, and the princes from Egypt, they went with him. And, he had chariots and horsemen. There was a great deal of people. This was a great procession that went back to Canaan. It must have taken them some while. That's another thing about that body, making sure that body, because after a couple of days, the body starts smelling and giving off odors and making noises. Great number of prominent people that went back with him, as well as all the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones, their flocks and their herds, they left in the land of Goshen. Now, I just mentioned, children and their livestock remained. So that tells you two things. Well, actually, one thing, they're coming back. I'm quite sure you're not going to leave your children there if you don't plan on coming back. Servants had to be left to watch the children, and they had to leave somebody there to watch the animals also. They go back to Canaan. They got this big procession going back to Canaan. And they never mentioned how long it would take, but I know it was about 300 miles. Now, Joseph had not seen Canaan in 39 years. So that made him about, I guess, 56, That he lived in Egypt 22 years before Jacob came. And then there was 17 more years. It was 13 years when he goes before Pharaoh. Yeah, and then there's 17 that Jacob stayed there. And then, of course, there was 5 years. We read about there were 5 years left when Jason came. And then there were 12 more. That would have been 17 years altogether. Or there were 9 years when you count the 7 years of planning, and then the 2 years with the 5 years left. It took me a while to figure that out. But Jacob's 17 years total of 39 years. Oh, yeah, Jacob was there for 17. It was a total of 39 years. Genesis 50 and 10. Then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned here with a great and very solemn lamentation. And he observed 7 days of mourning for his father. Okay, I want to show you something because I had I think I'll wait to the next one. Chariots and horsemen. Yeah, they had a bunch of chariots. They didn't say how many, but it was a good group of them. 300 miles trip. Came to the threshing floor of Atad. Now that name, Atad, it's said to mean a plain of thorn bushes. And they must have taken the long route because it said they went beyond the Jordan. And when they say beyond, they mean west. The most direct route they would not have taken, they would not have to cross Jordan because they came from the west. So how you going to go beyond the Jordan? And there it is, but that was west. Now, but when they say beyond, they mean west of. So it was west of the Jordan. I'll show you a place on the map to where it is, show you how the route they had to must have taken. And they're wondering why did they take this route the long way? May have been because of the Canaanites, or they thought something would happen with the Canaanites or whatever, but they wound up taking the long route to go. They came from the west, went around, and then crossed the Jordan. Beyond means west, in front of means east. Okay, the Hebrews were mourning there for 7 days. Now, this was what the Hebrews did. They mourned for 7 days. Normally, that's what it was, and I'm going to show you some verses about that. And this is the usual mourning period. Okay, now here's a verse. The Numbers 19 and 19. The clean person shall sprinkle the unclean on the third day. That's when somebody has died. And on the seventh day, he shall purify himself. So now it's over with. Wash his clothes and bathe in water, and at evening he shall be clean. So that was 7 days of mourning. 1 Samuel 31:13. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. 7 days. We must mourn, but it cannot go on indefinitely. Sometimes you have got to stop mourning. If you don't stop mourning, there's a lot of things that you would suffer or things that wouldn't get done. You can't mourn for an unreasonable amount of time. You know, most people say you should mourn for a year. You mourn for the loss of a loved one for a year, but you got to get back on your feet and do things you need to do and go on with your life. Now, Moses and Aaron had mourning period that was 30 days. But these were unusual. And here's theirs. Deuteronomy 34:8. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses ended. 30 days for Moses, and they did the same for Aaron. Now, when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, all the house of Israel mourned for Aaron 30 days. Okay, I wanted to show you now. They would be over here in Ramesses, and this would be over in the west, and they would go over into the east. And I'm going to enlarge it so you can see where Abel Mizram was. That was the name that they called it. It's right over here somewhere. There it is. There's Abel Mizram right there. Now, if they came from the west, the most direct route would be going just like this. But some kind or another, they went around. They must have went around this way, came up, and then came back across to Abel Mizram, or where the threshing floor of Atad was at. Okay, let's go on with our next verse. Genesis 50 and verse 11. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a deep mourning of the Egyptians." Therefore, its name was called Abel Mizram, which is beyond the Jordan. Maybe I should have showed that after I read this, but that's okay. Canaanites thought this was an Egyptian being buried because they saw all these Egyptians down there, but actually the ones that were actual mourning were the Hebrews, like I said, and they stayed there for 7 days, and then they went and took Jacob's body to Machpelah. Place named Mourning of Egyptians, Abel Mizram. That's the best I could do. Genesis 50, 12 and 13. So his sons did for him just as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which means east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as property for a burial place. His sons left the Egyptians and took the body of Jacob to Machpelah. I guess they wanted to have their last moments with the body of their father. He was buried with Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah in Machpelah, the cave that Abraham had purchased from the Hittite. It says in the file, but sometimes you be typing and they'll put in the word they want to put in there. In the field, Abraham brought. Now, this is down in Hebron. And, you know, when I think about it, I think about the Alamo, because I noticed if you saw in the picture, the whole town was around it. Well, when I first came here to Texas and I went downtown to go to a movie, and a fellow told me, look across the street, there's Alamo. And there was Alamo right across the street from the movie theater, right in the middle of town, and two buildings right on the side of it. And that's what I thought about when I saw the building that Herod had built, where the caves were beneath it. Genesis 50:14. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who went up with him to bury his father. They all returned after the burial. They had to go back. Well, they had to go back to get their children. Everything that they owned was back. The only thing they brought, I guess, was the food, the clothing that they needed to go and to make it back to their children and to the property that they had there in Egypt. They didn't leave Egypt again until 400 years later. Okay, that's the end of our lesson, and this takes us to our applications. It is fitting to mourn the loss of a loved one. It is also appropriate to make sure the dead are buried with dignity. Although the burial process is not identical in every culture, the need to grieve is constant. Let us show compassion toward those who mourn. When possible, weep with those who weep. At the same time, realize that Christians do not sorrow as others who have no hope. Because Jesus defeated death, we can as well. Death is not the end. Jacob's burial in Canaan served as a visible reminder that Egypt was not his home. Christians need a similar reminder about this world. At the longest, our time on this earth is brief. We must live in preparation for the eternal home in the heavens, awaiting the faithful. Paul told the Corinthians, for we know not that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Now we come to our questions. I believe we have 7 of them. First one, what did Joseph do after Jacob died? Well, he did what most people do when they lose a loved one. He wept and he kissed his father. He also closed his eyes. What did Joseph command his servants to do to Jacob? Well, we know he had to take his father back to Canaan, a trip of some 300 miles. And, they're kind of iffy about this mileage because they're not exactly sure where that Atad was. So they say about 300 miles. But they knew where Hebron was. They should have known what it was anyway. What did Joseph command his servants to do? He commanded them to embalm his father. How many days did the Egyptians mourn for Jacob? The Egyptians mourned 70 days, 40 for the embalming and then 30 more. What did Joseph ask Pharaoh permission to do? He asked Pharaoh, hey, because he just couldn't go and do it on his own. He asked permission to go and bury his father because he had taken an oath. Bury his father in Canaan. Where did the burial party mourn for Jacob? 7 days. When they talk about the burial party, actually they're talking about the Hebrews when they're at the threshing floor of Atad. Where was Jacob buried? He was buried with his father and his father's father. He was buried in Machpelah. What did Joseph and his brother do after the burial? They went back to Egypt. What else they going to do? Unless they was planning to go someplace else. But remember, they left their kids and their flocks and everything else in Egypt. They returned to Egypt. And that's the end of our lesson. And that's the end of Genesis. And I think we're through and we're going to start something new. And I usually look at it, but I didn't this time. Well, maybe I'll take a quick look. No, we got one more lesson in Genesis. I guess then that'll be the end of Genesis. Oh, thank you very much. I enjoy doing this, and I hope you'll be here next week for the next lesson. Thank you.